So we're now going to pick up with the second assignment that was given for 8.3, and this one's going to deal with the XYZ affair and then the Alien and Sedition Acts. So John Adams is president, sworn in 1797, and he immediately has to deal with an international event, and that one, of course, is the continuing war between France and Britain. And so Adams seeks to negotiate a treaty with France because what France has been doing over the time period is they've actually been seizing American ships. And the reason for that is due to our signature of the treaty with Great Britain, which they felt was sort of a knife in the back. So they are upset and they start seizing American ships. To avoid war, Adams sends a delegation to France. Okay? And that becomes an incident known as the XYZ affair. So these are those questions if you want to bring those up as we go through this presentation. If you recall, you had a sheet to read and then to answer these questions. We're going to come back to them in a second. So if you also remember, we had this art that you had to interpret with some of the ideas that these were the three American diplomats, and then here is this five-headed monster that represents the French government and some of the other French symbols around there with the guillotine and of course liberté and all these other things. So let's move on. So as you see in this little political cartoon, it's kind of a play off the mafia and the mob. And here you can sort of see the three French diplomats, X, Y, and Z, basically demanding a bribe, as he says right here. You can sort of see negotiations and John Adams down there. So I shared out a graphic organizer, so we're going to work through that soon. And here's that graphic organizer dealing with the series of laws passed by the Federalist Congress under John Adams. And this is a reaction to, the domestic reaction to the XYZ affair. And so the Americans are upset, they're enraged, they're disrespected, and so they come back and they come up with these various laws to deal with these situations. So the first one's the Alien Act, and that act gave the president the power to deport or arrest any dangerous aliens. Now, the point of this was it was up to the president to determine who was dangerous or disloyal. And also another thing that was headed after immigrants was this Naturalization Act. There are two types of citizens in the United States. There are natural or native-born citizens, and then there are naturalized citizens. Naturalized means you go through the process. And usually it's fill out forms, you take some tests, you live here a certain number of years. And what this did is it lengthened the time to go from 5 years, what it used to be, all the way up to 14 years. And the point of these two things is basically aimed at immigrants because Adams found that the new immigrants that came to this country tend to decide with the opposition party, the Democratic Republicans. And so if you were a new immigrant and you were just almost to the 5-year anniversary, you might be persuaded to leave the country and go back somewhere to your own country. And that's the point of this. If you were also a new alien, you didn't want to speak out because you didn't want to be deported. So both of these were aimed at the political opposition. And finally, this one, the Sedition Act. The sedition is a crime, even still today, to any active participation to bring down your government. So what happened was it was illegal. It was illegal for you to speak, write, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious remarks about the president. So John Adams was a lot of things, but what he was not was very thick-skinned. And so he had his Congress pass a law, and then he signed it into law that made it a crime for you to basically speak out against them. Now we're going to move on to the next slide, which looks like this. And basically my question, and yours is arranged a little differently, says, what's the real reason for the passage of these acts? And basically the main reason is to silence criticism. The Federalists were in power, they didn't like to be criticized, and so they took that power to silence Republican criticism. And you have to understand where criticism would have shown up at that time, and that would be in the newspaper. And so there was numbers between 17 and 25 Republican newspaper editors that were actually arrested for violating the Sedition Act, and their only crime was they had published pieces, articles that were critical of the John Adams administration. And so if we stop here and think, well, the XYZ affair was a cause, and then the effect would be the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, now if we move the Alien Sedition Acts into a cause, the effect of those is the passage of something that's in reaction to them, which is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And so what these two things were basically fighting back against the Federalists by the Republicans. And what they said was this. They said that states, they proposed, had the power to cancel or nullify a federal law. This is just an idea. And they were meant to challenge the Alien Sedition Acts that they felt were unconstitutional. And they were passed and written by the two leaders of the opposition party. So they would be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So I want to make sure everybody has the correct responses for the assignments that you submitted to me. So I'm going to bring up the two different sheets that you submitted. And so I want you to just take the time. And if you need to stop the presentation, that's fine. But basically, I noticed that some of you thought that they were asking for a number in number one. When it says, how did many? I think some of you read how many. And it's not that. It said, how did many Republican editors of newspapers express their feelings? Well, they didn't express them well. They called him a tyrant. And so who does Adams blame for all the negative criticism? Well, he blamed new immigrants and also newspaper editors. And then what party were most of the new immigrants going to be part of? The Republican Party. You were supposed to do original sentences here. So if you did not get full credit, that's probably why you're supposed to do that. Then let's do this last one. How did the Alien Act make it dangerous for being a new immigrant during this time? Well, imagine if you're a new immigrant and you go to a rally, you go to some kind of hearing, and you speak out and share your feelings. Well, the idea, you could be deported simply because the president would deem you either dangerous or disloyal. And so it was completely up to the president to determine that situation in that state. And then finally, the sheet on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. If you read through it, it's pretty straightforward. Nullify means to stop or to cancel. And so what Jefferson and Madison do in their theory of states' rights is exactly what it says. It's the belief that states have certain rights. And so they had powers that the federal government could not violate. They could not stop. They couldn't take away. That was what they were proposing, because they saw the Federalist Party and the Federalist government overreaching their power and basically being tyrannical in their use of power. How might the theory of states' rights undermine the federal government? Well, if you're concerned about power in the center of the country coming down from the national government, it could challenge its authority. And so that's why Federalists were opposed to it. These two basically get a little bit more particular. What does the Kentucky-Virginia resolution propose? That states could nullify. We talked about that. And then the Virginia one says, and Madison wrote this one, that they could interpose, which means sort of get in the middle between the federal government and its own citizens of the state. But basically what they both declared is that they felt that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, which they would prove it to be. They basically were thrown out by the courts as being a violation of the Constitution. Now, the thing that started all this was that Adams wanted a treaty with France. And remember what we know about which party favors France, which party is opposed to France. And so here John Adams has everything in his sights to basically go to war with the dreaded enemy of the Federalist Party. And yet he sends another delegation over to Paris and works out an agreement which actually is negative for him because it splits his party in support of him as the election comes up in 1800. So that's where we'll end right now.